Euclid's first common notion is this: things which are equal to the same thing are equal to each other. That's a rule of mathematical reasoning. It's true because it works. Has done and always will do. In his book, Euclid says this is self-evident. You see, there it is, even in that 2,000-year-old book of mechanical law. It is a self-evident truth that things which are equal to the same thing are equal to each other.
Velkommen til Filmz TV. Forleden var der dansk biografpremiere på Steven Spielbergs Lincoln, et storslået historisk drama om USA's 16. præsident, Abraham Lincoln, og hans kamp for at gennemtrumfe den såkaldte 13. forfatningsændring, som skulle afskaffe slaveriet. Imens er den amerikanske borgerkrig i fuld gang, og Lincoln er selv i en kamp mod tiden for at få afskaffet den afskyelige slavepraksis, før nationen atter samles, og sydstaterne får mulighed for at nedstemme forfatningsændringen. Lincoln er nomineret til hele 12 Oscars, og i dagens Filmz TV har vi adskillige interviews med flere af filmens nominerede filmmager og skuespillere. Det er blandt Spielberg og day+lewis. 20th Century Fox har været så venlige at sende os interviewene, som vi selv har klippet sammen til en lille mini-dokumentar.
We're stepped out upon the world's stage now, with the fate of human dignity in our hands. Blood's been spilled to afford us this moment. Now!
Well, we focused only on the last 4 months of Lincoln's life because we wanted to show Lincoln accomplishing something great, something really monumental, and that was abolishing slavery and ending the Civil War. However, we also wanted to show that he was a man, not a monument, and that our best hope of understanding and doing justice to this immensely complicated person was to depict him beginning and then conducting and then concluding a very, very complex action, which was the fight to pass the 13th Amendment. Yes, I think it could be a challenge for 2012 audiences to go back into the 19th century world in which the Democratic Party is conservative and the Republican Party is liberal and progressive. But that was actually the case in that part of the 19th century. And the pathways that both of these parties took to the present day, in which they basically traded political places, could be the subject of lots of movies and stories.
I've heard many people speak of Lincoln as being a first sort of contemporary president. And I think this film speaks to that, because you see him operating as a politician and having to function within the politics of Washington in a very divided country.
It's the man himself that invites you because he was so open, and that was one of the most beautiful surprises of getting to know him was how insanely accessible that man was. At the time, it was actually physically very dangerous, in his case, to be accessible. But the White House was, an ever-open door. People could come and go, and he was accessible. So that became an opening in a way, I think. One almost felt welcomed. And so really, he put me at my ease, strangely. Having first made me very uneasy, it was him that put me at my ease and gave me the thought that, well, maybe I could try to do this.
Everyone on set had the same experience of moments watching on the video camera where, he would move his head slightly and he was Daniel Day-Lewis, and he would move his head another way and it looked like a Alexander Gardner photograph of Lincoln. I mean, you just, it's a weird kind of double image thing that you get all the way through watching the film. You see this very familiar movie star face, and then also the face of, probably one of the most familiar faces in all of human history.
I am so enriched by having the opportunity to work so closely with him and Steven. But from the time I got the role, and it became released to the press, which was a few months after that, he and I started texting each other regularly, very regularly, but completely in character. it was very hard to do because you had to think of the dialect of the time of how people spoke, and so I really had to work at it. And he would send me limericks, and he would say this or that, and we would just out of the blue something, and it was constant, and it began to build a small thread of intimacy.
I wanted everybody to feel there was a real sense of authenticity on the set, where the only real imposition would be that there was a camera and there were monitors, and that would be the only real imposition on the time period. So I simply asked the actors when they came onto the set not to kibitz, not to talk about, you know, the book they were reading or sports scores or what was happening at home with their families. Save all that when you go outside of the space we're shooting in, but to bring a kind of respect to the story we're telling.
He's just open. The best thing anyone can ever be in any creative workplace is open, and to have that degree of openness alongside his sense of structure is a pretty powerful combination, because he can do the structural work standing on his head. I don't know if it comes easily. He makes it seem, like all great men, he makes it seem as if it comes easily.
As you know, there are various ways to interpret a screenplay for a cinematographer, but immediately it was very clear to me that this is a story that should be a little bit restrained in terms of the photography. We should not do any specific color changes. We should not manipulate the negative. We should just photograph it in the most beautiful, the most elegant way, simply because the language was so beautiful and the performances were so stunning that photography was merely there to record the actors' work and the screenwriters' words, you know.
So Steven and I think when we begin a project, we both confess to each other that we're both a little scared. Do we really know what to do? Every one of these things is a cliffhanger in a way. You have so many decisions to make and so many choices to make that you can only hope that you're being guided at that moment by to begin with the right aesthetic, the right sense of the moment. Steven is always a great partner in this. I mean, the thing that I've always felt with him over now 40 years of working together is he can never get enough music. I could have recorded 2 hours of music and be quite happy. He's a man that loves music, respects it greatly, understands it very well, and he has the heart and soul of a musician. I've always felt that.
Steven cautioned me that this was not similar to previous projects we'd worked on. You know, most of what I had been connected with, the Indiana Jones films, for instance, were loud, bombastic movies full of flame and fire and fights. And this was going to be very different, he said. This was going to be a political story. Dialogue was going to be probably right out there being the most important element in the soundtrack. But he needed details and he needed subtleties to create the time period and the place and to enhance the characters where we could. And so we knew that the door was being opened to something unlike the kind of film I was used to working on with Steven. Audio recording really wasn't invented until about 10 years after Lincoln was assassinated by Thomas Edison invented the phonograph in the middle 1870s. But I thought that perhaps there would be artifacts in museums or in collections around the country that might have objects that Lincoln actually heard in his life. And so I set about researching where are things that Lincoln actually heard. And it led down many interesting paths. The watch that Lincoln had in his pocket when he went to Ford's Theater found its way into the Kentucky Historical Society just a few years ago. I called them up, I asked them about recording the watch, and they were very excited. Once again, they had never wound it up to see if it functioned. And they brought a watchsmith out, and they carefully wound it up, and by golly, there it was, ticking away, perhaps for the first time in well over a century. We don't really know. And when I got those recordings back, it was really a thrill to know that this ticking was the sound that was close to Lincoln's heart.
As to whether Lincoln was the greatest president we've ever, had in this country, Lincoln certainly guided our country through its worst crisis in its entire history, and more than any other single person, he helped the United States to survive. And we feel that in doing this, he helped the idea of democracy as a viable political system to survive. And more than any other single person, Lincoln helped end slavery.
Not quite sure what to do with yourself when it's finished. The investment has usually, for most of us, been if not total, then close to total investment of that period of our lives in the process of telling that particular story. So it's very hard to conceive of any kind of a life after it. Of course, there is one waiting, usually quite impatiently. But in this particular case, I felt two things at one and the same time. One was a sense of immeasurable privilege at having been enabled to explore that man's life. And the other, directly as a result of that, was a sense of great sadness and loss that time allowed me was now over. Because he did become, for me, there's never been a human being that I never met that I loved as much as him, ever. I doubt there ever will be.
Husk, at du kan finde alle vores tidligere Filmz TV-udsendelser på Filmz under Filmz TV-fanebladet, og også på video.dk, i iTunes og via vores gratis video-app.